Hold on to your tentacles.
It's crossover review time.
I'm CJ, filling in for Callie, and I make a series called What's with Games, where I answer questions about games. Also, there are awkward pauses.
I'm Jeff, filling in for Best Girl, and I make all of the stuff that you were already watching on this channel, probably. This introduction isn't strictly necessary, but Callie and Mari do this whole call and answer thing that I just wanted to make happen.
But Jeff, you make What's in a Game, and I make What's with Games. Won't that get confusing?
Maybe. Don't worry about it.
Okay, so what game are we reviewing?
You do it... We're doing a bit. We're doing a bit from the thing.
We're reviewing Konami's erotic Castlevania pachinko machine?
It's Splatoon. It's obviously Splatoon.
Okay, no need to get testy. What score are we giving it?
Well, now that every map is out, we can evaluate the complete package. It gets a silver medal. That's a game that I'd actively hound friends to play, which I actually have done before.
So have I. We should probably get to reviewing it though. But first, remember, stay fresh! Yeah, Jeff, I don't know if I'm gonna go along with the whole stay fresh thing. That's kind of embarrassing.
God, I feel like such a fucking sellout when I say that. Sometimes when you think of a game company, it puts an image in your head. Capcom evokes a muggy day in a dingy arcade, throwing trash talk at the guy next to you and tossing away quarters in pursuit of a high score. Rockstar brings to mind extravagant parties thrown in limos with hot tubs and spinning rims and booming subwoofers. When you think of Konami, you think, bleh, bleh, bleh. When I think of Nintendo, I think of a long summer afternoon, not spent indoors playing games, but outside lounging on the beach or running around in the backyard. A preponderance of Nintendo games, especially from the GameCube era, are set on tropical beachfront property, but that's just a small part of it. Their color palette of choice involves bright blue skies and verdant green hills and sunset hues of red and yellow. Supposedly timeless games like Animal Crossing focus on summer activities like catching bugs, fishing, and gardening. Hell, some of their flagship titles are basically What I Did on Holiday essays by the likes of Shigeru Miyamoto and Satoshi Tajiri. Splatoon is far and away the most summery game Nintendo has made since Super Mario Sunshine. Every time I turn it on, I feel like I'm going on summer vacation. I don't know about you, CJ, but for me, Splatoon is the most fun I've had with my Wii U since I got it, and it's hooked me harder than any multiplayer game this side of my one true love, Hearthstone.
Splatoon feels like a return to form for Nintendo's in-house development teams. While the company has developed a lot of new IPs through second and third-party teams like Intelligent Systems and Monolith, Nintendo EAD has largely focused its efforts on casual targeted properties like Wii Sports and Nintendogs. For the first time since Pikmin, Nintendo has something new to offer core gamers, a third-person shooter. Although it's their first crack at the genre, Splatoon is as tightly polished and beautifully presented as we've come to expect from the house that Mario built. And it demonstrates a sophisticated grasp of what makes online multiplayer work, despite Nintendo's seeming inability to understand online anything else. The game puts you in the stylish name-brand shoes of an Inkling, a little creature that's half squid, half kid, and tosses you into the mean streets of Inkopolis for a knockdown, drag-out turf war. That would be a lot more dramatic if turf wars weren't overblown squirt gun fights with ink instead of water. Like many other online console shooters, Splatoon tosses you onto a randomly selected team, in this case a team of 4, and tasks you with decimating the competition. The difference is, instead of going for kills, your goal is to spread your team's ink to as much of the map as possible.
Beyond being both your primary weapon and scoring mechanism, Splatoon's ink has a lot of uses. When enemies walk through territory covered in it, they slow down and become more vulnerable to your attacks. You can also turn into a squid at any time and swim at high speeds through your own team's ink, even if it's sprayed up the side of a wall. This mechanic allows you to forge some interesting pathways through the game's 15 maps. In much the same way Portal forced us to think with portals, you need to learn how to think with ink if you want to excel in Splatoon's online multiplayer. Everything in the game is designed to support these unique methods of traversal and combat.
Splatoon's ink hits the ideal sweet spot for a core game mechanic. It's both surprising and immediately intuitive. The first time you swim up a wall feels awesome and fresh, but it also gets your brain immediately thinking about new ways to traverse whatever area is in front of you. Really though, it just feels great to use, as do a lot of the small things in Splatoon's mechanics set, like the super jump that lets you quickly get to where your teammates are. This is why I like to think of Nintendo as the Disney of video games. They just polish the hell out of everything. And honestly, the ink mechanic is genius. It makes online multiplayer a lot less predictable than your average shooter, and it lends itself to some really ingenious single-player levels. It works as both a toy that's fun to play around with, and as a tool that presents a number of diverse strategic options.
I think it does something even more brilliant than that, though. It boils down the competitive online shooter to its most essential element. A lot of the time when I play Halo, Counter-Strike, or TF2 with friends, they talk about needing to improve their aim, but that's a very small part of what goes into playing these games well. The secret to dominating in a shooter isn't landing headshots every time you pull the trigger, or even having fast reflexes, though obviously aim and reflexes are important. Rather, it's understanding each map's layouts and using it to your advantage. Predicting where the enemy will come from and getting into a good position to stop them is the basis of high-level shooter play. In most games, this aspect is downplayed or abstracted. The almighty KDR is what puts you at the top of the leaderboard, even if your team loses an objective while you're running around strategically unimportant areas killing noobs. In Splatoon, though, while your splats are counted, it's the territory you cover that determines your final score and whether your team wins or loses. Splatoon rewards you for creating a clear path for your teammates to move up from the spawn zone, limiting your enemy's movement options, and generally helping to maintain map control. Splatting the enemy temporarily reduces the amount of territory they can cover at a time, but you can be instrumental in winning a match just by staying alive and making sure your teammates have room to swim. In this way, I think Splatoon is similar to Rising Thunder, a fighting game where special moves are tied to single buttons with cooldowns rather than complex multi-button inputs. By sidelining aspects of the genre that otherwise get in the way, it lets you get to the heart of what makes it, and games like it, really fun and engaging.
Splatoon makes a lot of decisions that seem to run counter to competitive team play though, the most obvious being the lack of voice chat. Voice was obviously left out to make the game more kid-friendly, but a lot of players complain that it makes it hard to coordinate with teammates. However, the game is designed around having no voice chat, and making teamwork happen in this environment is a lot easier than it would first appear. The painting mechanic subtly encourages cooperation. It makes sense to follow paths your teammates have already carved, and when you get into enemy territory, the imperative of trying to cover as much ground as possible naturally leads into flanking strategies. Splatoon presents a lot of interesting minute-to-minute and second-to-second decisions, and the optimal answer to most questions the game poses supports team play in one way or another. So as long as everyone on your team is trying to do their best, working together will come almost automatically.
That's assuming that they are actually trying. It's not a lot of fun to play a lopsided match where one of your teammates is just running circles around your spawn area, or worse, sitting on top of spawn AFK for the whole round. And don't even get me started on what it's like to join a team full of rollers. It's a good ambush weapon, but the role it plays in matches only needs one player to fill it, and you're not even doing it right anyway!
You're getting a little ahead of yourself, Jeff. We don't have weapons scheduled for another few minutes.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I am right. I'm always right. And while what you're complaining about can definitely be a problem, the nice thing about how Splatoon is designed is that your team can totally make a comeback if you manage to rally. Even when the timer ticks down to the last minute and the music kicks into panicky high gear, there are ways to recover. The more ink the enemy has on the board, the more you can take away as you expand your coverage. This is kind of obvious, but every point your team gains from covering enemy ink is a point the enemy team loses, which allows for potentially huge last-minute swings. And true to form for Nintendo, there are a few rubber banding mechanics to help this along, though nothing quite as game-breaking as the blue shell. The big one, which might not seem like a recovery mechanic at all on the face of things, is the special attack. For every point of ground you cover, you fill a special meter at the top right corner of the screen that lets you unleash a devastating special power. Depending on your weapon loadout, this can be turning into an invincible giant squid, firing a long-range airstrike, loosing a torrent of bombs, gaining a temporary mid-range inkzooka, or a number of support-oriented abilities. All of these, used correctly, can turn the tide of a battle, but the clever thing about them is that you can't build your meter while spraying ink at your own territory. So, if one team is winning a turf war, the other will naturally have more opportunities to unleash these devastating powers.
It definitely makes for closer, and therefore more interesting matches. You have to stay on your toes right up to the end, because victory is never fully assured. However, I do take issue with some of the special weapons that you didn't mention. The echolocator can be really useful, but it can't really turn games around on its own, and it feels more than a little underpowered next to the rest of the lineup. As for the killer whale, I don't have problems with how it's designed, per se. I think it works really well as a temporary area denial tool, but the way it's conveyed could use a bit of work. Specifically, the hitbox at the edge of the whales can be a little confusing. When your squid is swimming in ink, it looks like it's flattened into the surface of the wall, but technically it's clipping through it, so diving into the ink next to the whale's AoE can kill you even when it looks like it shouldn't. Also, the sound effect that accompanies it doesn't change properly to accommodate players with a special duration up ability equipped, which can lead to cases where it persists longer than it seems like it should. The poor conveyance can make it feel a little unfair, even though mechanically it's very well balanced. That's mostly a nitpick though. What isn't a nitpick is my issue with the bubbler. Temporary invincibility is really strong in any shooter. It's so strong that they had to make you totally immobile while using it in Halo, and armor lock is still considered to be pretty overpowered. When you activate the bubbler, you're given free range of movement. You can fire your weapon as you please, and allies nearby become temporarily invincible too. It creates a situation where the opponent's only option is to run and cede turf to your team, and it allows for totally unbeatable pushes, whereas a skilled player can kill you before you can manage to fire your Inkzuka or Ink Strike. In a pinch, it also works as a hard counter to every other special weapon in the game. Mind you, the Kraken also has this benefit, but at least it restricts your movement and attack options and leaves you a little vulnerable when you're done using it. The bubbler is straight up overpowered, and there'd be no reason not to use it if not for one very smart balance decision that the game makes.
Yeah, the way Splatoon handles weapon loadouts is really sharp. Instead of letting you build your own custom loadouts, every weapon in the game comes with a preset configuration of sub-weapons and special weapons. So while the bubbler is a little overpowered, its use is limited to fairly few basic items like the splatter shot and blasters, along with a few more powerful but limited special weapons. If you want to bubble up, you have to stick to specific roles like aggressive sniping with the Squiffer or ambushing with the Inkbrush or Slosher. And in all likelihood, you'll want to try something different since Splatoon offers a wide array of distinctive and fun-to-use weapons. In addition to various flavors of basic rapid-fire shooters, you have close-range ink buckets, long-range charge-up sniper rifles and splatling guns, and rollers which can be used to lay down continuous streams of ink.
Those darn rollers!
Each of these weapon types requires vastly different strategies to utilize properly, and even within the types, differences in range, fire rate, and power can totally change how a weapon handles. Every weapon you use opens up different options, and everyone you face online poses a different challenge. In addition to your main weapon, there are sub-weapons with various utilities that use higher amounts of ink. Many of these are bombs, like the sticky bombs, mines, grenades, seekers, and the weak but fast water balloons, but there are also fixed turret items like the splash wall and sprinkler that help with area denial, and support tools like the point sensor and the squid beacon that can help your team advance. Then there's the disruptor, which is no fun at all! On paper, it doesn't seem like such an awful idea. Instead of killing you when it hits you, it limits your movement and attack options temporarily, leaving you practically defenseless. In practice though, that's the last thing a game like Splatoon needs. The movement options are what makes Splatoon fun in the first place, and taking them away, however briefly, stops the game from being fun. It's frustrating to be killed by a splat bomb when you don't see it coming, but it's infuriating to be hit with a disruptor and wait around slowly as your opponents leisurely pick you off.
A big part of the problem is that it's really hard to avoid. It activates on contact with the ground, and the blast travels around corners and some walls, which makes it as effective as burst bombs, except that unlike burst bombs, getting hit with just one disruptor almost always means you're dead. In terms of game balance, the disruptor is necessary for curbing the power of certain weapon types, and it's not really overpowered in itself, it's just not fun to interact with, which is a recurring theme among the parts of Splatoon that we didn't enjoy, like Hammerhead Bridge.
Ugh, don't get me started on the bridge. Now conceptually the level isn't awful as long as both teams are on equal footing. It can be pretty fun to fight for control of the upper and lower levels of the middle section. The problem is what happens when one team does take control. Because the routes out of both spawn points are bottlenecks, once a team is pushed back to spawn, there's very little they can do to get back out. What this means is that if a few members of either team don't pull their weight for just a little while, it can put them in a near impossible position, which isn't much fun for anyone. If you're on the losing team, it's frustrating, and if you're on the winning team, the only decision left to make is whether you move up to lock down the spawn or hold back to pick off stragglers. And it's a shame too, because the middle of the map is well designed with a tight labyrinth structure that creates a lot of opportunities for sneaky surprises.
We're only harping on that one weak point because the rest of the maps are so strong though, which is another recurring theme amid all this criticism. The maps in Splatoon are generally designed to take full advantage of the Inkling's unique movement abilities and create lots of interesting back and forth between the teams. The best maps are more well-rounded, leaving plenty of options for where to go right from the start. Splatoon is at its best when neither team can be absolutely sure where the enemy will be coming from. That dynamic keeps your reflexes sharp and your pulse pounding. Levels with lots of vertical elements also tend to be stronger, since swimming up walls allows for unique angles of attack. In that regard, we found Kelp Dome, Salt Spray Rig, Walleye Warehouse, Moray Towers, Flounder Heights, and Mahi Mahi Resort to be the most fun. The interplay between upper and lower levels, as well as a balance of fighting for the edges and middle of each map, makes for dynamic and unpredictable matches that stay fun round after round. Which is important because at any given time you log into Splatoon, you're going to be stuck on just a handful of maps. Instead of letting players choose any map at any time, Splatoon offers just 2 that rotate out on a 4-hour cycle. Playing the same maps over and over can get pretty tedious, but there are some upsides to this. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, it counters the potential negative aspects of the Wii U's low install base. No matter how small the online population might be, it's always possible to find a match because everyone's on the same maps.
It also means you can come back to Splatoon multiple times throughout the day and have a different experience each time. The inability to binge lets the game stay fresher in the long term. And technically speaking, you do have access to 4 maps at a time. It's just that 2 of them are tied up in rank mode, which I'm not a fan of. You have to reach level 10 before you can even play in ranked, which is more than a bit of a grind. Ranked play puts you in special objective-driven match types where teamwork becomes all the more vital. Splat Zones is a variation of King of the Hill where you have to keep your ink planted in a specific part of the map while a timer ticks down. Tower control is a lot like the payload mode in TF2, and Rainmaker is a weird variation on Capture the Flag, where the flag is a powerful but slow weapon. The ranked game modes aren't inherently bad by any means, but like I said, it makes focused teamwork much more integral. This can be really hard to do because often you'll go in without any prior communication to your team. If you're unlucky enough to all be using the same weapon, you're at a major disadvantage. Ranked is best played in a squad with friends.
Personally, I'm a big fan of ranked play. Turf War is a lot of fun and really well designed in general, but the new modes add some much needed variety to the mix, and they draw out the latent potential of certain maps. Mahi Mahi Resort is a lot of fun in any mode, but it's an absolute riot to play in Splat Zones. The raising and lowering platforms and abundance of attack routes keep the action fun and frenetic right up to the end and make knockout victories rare. Likewise, Urchin Underpass really comes alive once the Rainmaker is unleashed on it. The more competitive atmosphere of the mode can feel a little stifling, and the slow grind for items and levels makes losing feel like a real waste of time, but actually playing the game modes is so fun that it renders these points moot in my eyes.
As for me, I feel like I get just enough variety from the 3-map rotation on Splatfest. Speaking of those, we should probably talk about them. These monthly events are a big part of Nintendo's plans to keep the game feeling fresh after launch. Every month or so, Splatoon polls users to see where they fall on heated divisive issues. Cats versus dogs, Autobots versus Decepticons, the questions of our time. Depending on their answers, players end up on one team or another battling for supremacy. This basically boils down to more turf wars, but there are a few key differences. Firstly, you rotate through 3 maps during the event instead of 2, which was just enough variety for me to play and end up losing 4 straight hours. Secondly, all of the stages change from day to night.
I know it sounds a little shallow, but that shift in aesthetics is probably my favorite part of Splatfest. 2 big monitor trucks drive into the game's hub, Inkopolis, and turn the whole place into a giant block party. Inklings dance in the streets, neon signs taken straight from Miiverse posts line the walls, and Callie and Mari sing and dance for the crowd. It's a blast. On that subject, I really enjoy the game's overall aesthetic too. With Miiverse graffiti sprayed on the walls and Inklings walking around in fashionable gear, the game captures the hip youth culture of downtown Tokyo in much the same way as The World Ends With You or Jet Set Radio, and I love those games to pieces, so I guess it would make sense that I love this too. The hip, punk-infused music that accompanies multiplayer matches also plays into that counterculture edge, and I adore it. It's as though Nintendo took the soundtrack to Jet Set Radio and put a KK slider filter on it. Like Persona 3's Mass Destruction, these themes never get old no matter how much you listen to them, which is important because you'll be hearing them a lot. In general, the game does a lot of things right with its music and sound design, setting a good tone, getting your heart racing, and inducing a little bit of panic with the frantic variant track that kicks in during the last moments of each map. We'll talk about that a bit more when we cover the single player though. Like The World Ends With You, Splatoon does a lot to gamify your fashion choices. You can kit your Inkling out in whatever shirt, hat, and kicks you want, with each carrying a semi-random assortment of character buffing abilities. These range from decreasing the time it takes to use your special weapons, to increasing your strength, to letting you move through ink stealthily at the cost of some speed. Having a good loadout of abilities won't decide a match on its own, but it does provide a cool way to augment your strategy of choice. The abilities being random can make it a little tricky to create an optimal character build, but on the flip side, it does encourage you to experiment, which makes the game more fun on the whole.
Optimizing your gear requires a currency called Super Sea Snails, which is where Splatfests come in again. Every rank you earn in Splatfest gets you snails, and you get a bonus if your team wins the most matches. Unfortunately, the team that ends up winning can feel a bit unfair. Due to various factors, things are currently weighted pretty heavily against whichever side is the most popular. The way that matchmaking works is that you need 2 teams, so if it turns out that there are more players on one team than another, the team with more players will often end up playing against itself. Now, these matches don't count toward your team's overall win percentage, but they do reward experience for Splatfest. And since most players are only going to play until they reach the top rank of King or Queen, and better players are naturally going to do that faster, this means that the best players on the more popular side end up playing fewer rounds for their teams than those on the less popular side. And of course, since Splatfest draws in players who don't normally play online much, which is the intent of the event, nothing wrong with that, it ends up exacerbating the problems created by inexperienced and AFK players. The best way to work within this system ends up being to try to pick whichever option seems like it'll be less popular rather than which one you like more, which ends up defeating a lot of the point. If you do want to ruin your fun that way though, it's at least easy to guess. Mary's pick is usually the most popular, so you should probably go with Callie.
Well, Mari is best girl.
Well, yeah, but I fail to see how that makes any...
It matters because Mari is best girl. Actually, both of the Squid Sisters are pretty awesome, especially when they show up in the single-player campaign. BAM! Perfect segue. Da-da! So yeah, in defiance of most other multiplayer-focused games these days, Splatoon has dedicated single-player, and it's actually pretty good. The story's nothing to write home about. A bunch of evil octopus people called Octarians have stolen the Inkling's primary power source, and you have to get it back. One thing I will say in favor of the single-player story is that it's presented in a really cool way. Instead of being pushed to the forefront of the hub world, the single-player is tucked away in a corner, hidden in a way that only serves to draw more attention to it. The fact that you have to follow a crazy-looking old man down a sewer just to start your adventure makes it feel more dangerous and exciting. The game goes for that secret heroes fighting a secret invasion story that's so popular in Saturday morning cartoons, and for my money, it absolutely nails it.
I think it also nails the gameplay. There's a ton of variety between levels in the campaign, with each one forcing you to think about how to traverse the environment and take out enemies in new ways. It is a little on the easy side, but I had a ton of fun inking up the levels and swimming around on the floating platforms. Each area feels really different from the last. The game uses a ton of different environmental assets to ensure you never get tired of your surroundings. On one level, you might be running around a summer camp, but on the next, you'll be swimming around on a Mirror's Edge-esque cityscape. There's just as much variety here as in the multiplayer maps, and the gameplay changes up from level to level as well. In standard stages, your goal is to move across floating platforms and kill enemies as you head towards the goal, but certain stages force you to contend with constant incoming airstrikes or take off a squad of Octolings. I'm not a huge fan of the Octoling levels though.
Yeah, me neither. The AI just doesn't put up the same kind of fight as a real player would, so these levels kind of pale in comparison to the online multiplayer. And while I had fun playing the single player, I couldn't help feeling that it was a little unfocused. None of the levels really do much to prepare you for the online, but the game seems to feel like it has to include a lot of shooting, so it ends up feeling a little dumbed down. It really shines when it turns into a puzzle platformer with the ink gun, almost like one of the Portal games. Figuring out how to get from point A to point B with the Inkling's moveset is a lot of fun, but the game doesn't really explore all the possibilities its mechanics present for a puzzle game either, so those levels end up feeling a little half-baked. It gets a bit better if you pick up the Squid Amiibo challenge levels, which see you trying to traverse stages with a limited ink supply, but I still can't help feeling there's untapped potential here for a really great puzzler. I think they could have gone in a completely different direction and turned it into more of a sandbox game too. Something with big, explorable, objective-driven levels like Jet Set Radio or Tony Hawk. It's really fun to move around the world as a squid. Hell, I had a blast just jetting around the campaign hub, but the small amount of exploration needed to find collectibles in each stage doesn't really scratch that itch either. Splatoon has a really incredible core mechanic, but I just don't think they exploited it enough in the single player, even if what they gave us was fun, mostly. I'm not a fan of the bosses, which really surprised me since Nintendo usually does those so well.
Really? I had a lot of fun with them. The first one, the Octo Stomp, is really neat in how it forces you to apply everything you know about the Inkling's movement mechanics to beat it. And the way the Octomaw comes up and tries to eat you is really awesome, even if it is kinda super easy.
Those were the ones I liked most too, but the other ones just felt tedious. That thing with the hose on its face is too straightforward except for the pit of ink around it, which seemingly only exists to create cheap accidental deaths. And the one that rolls around the arena is such a bog standard wait for it to expose its weak point fight that it barely feels interactive. The rest of them at least require that you lead their AI a bit, but that one is just a waiting game. And speaking of waiting games, fighting DJ Octavio is just a headache. Going through the same motions in 5 separate stages is so goddamn tedious.
I think that the way you have to fight him is pretty fun, personally. Dealing with all his projectiles and the enemies swarming around you, shooting his fists out of the sky, and making sure you have the space to move around in is a chaotic juggling act. And it's just what a good final boss should be. Also, the puns he throws at you while fighting are 100% certified fresh. When I first fought him, I definitely agreed that the fight seemed to go on a little too long, but looking back at it, I would have been pretty disappointed if it was a short and easy boss fight just like the others. Making the final boss as drawn out and challenging as it was made the stakes feel much higher, and it somehow never ended up grating on my patience, though I can certainly see how others would disagree. Also, you can't deny how hype it is when the Squid Sisters show up to help you out with the last stages of the fight and hack their music into Octavio's techno mix.
Okay, yeah, I will give it that. Nintendo's always been good at creating chill-inducing musical cues to amp up the last moments of their games, but holy cow is that an incredible moment. Definitely got me pumped to finish the fight. I just wish finishing it didn't take so long. With that said, I really like how the campaign differentiates itself from the multiplayer with its music. Some reviewers have complained that the campaign music sounds worse, but for my money, the industrial edge of the Octarians' music gives a great impression of their culture and why they view the Inklings as enemies.
That, and it matches the tempo of the single-player levels. In general, they're a lot more laid back compared to the madness of turf wars and ranked matches. Plus, there are enough variant tracks that they rarely repeat. They enhance the distinct visual flavor of each level. One really cool touch is the fact that you can hear each song coming out of the kettles in the hub world before you go into the levels. Little details like that help to make the whole world feel connected despite the rigid division of levels. That design sensibility also bleeds over into the multiplayer maps. You can usually see Inkopolis from somewhere in each map, and sometimes you can even see certain arenas off in the background of other ones. It helps to give you a sense of place in Splatoon's world.
For such a gameplay-first title, I'm impressed with the effort Nintendo put into world building. Like you said, Inkopolis feels very big and real despite being a series of enclosed zones, and on top of that, the little bit of backstory you find through collectible scrolls in single player is really cool. Not only do you learn the inky history of the Inklings and Octarians through these scrolls, you also learn about the world before them, today's Earth flooded and brought to ruin by global warming. It's a surprisingly heavy plot point for a kid's game, reminiscent of Adventure Time's Great Mushroom War. There was even a great moment of dark humor in the recent Past vs. Future Splatfest, where Callie said that she'd like to go back in time and meet one of those humans she's heard about.
This actually speaks so much to what makes Splatoon so good in general. The design of the game is very kid-friendly, but there's plenty for a grown-up to think about and get invested in if they want to dig a bit deeper. It has enough meat to hit home for both the casual and hardcore crowds. It's a bit of a cliche, but Splatoon is easy to learn and hard to master.
I agree, and it definitely hits that sweet spot a lot better than other Nintendo multiplayer offerings like Smash Bros. Or Mario Kart. I'm a little sad Splatoon had to come out for an underperforming console like the Wii U, because with the attention Nintendo has given it so far, I could see it developing a serious competitive scene. It's just hard to reach the sustainability required for that with such a small potential player base. But I'm immensely glad that it came out at all, and honestly, I'm impressed by how lively the servers are half a year on, even if I mostly end up playing against Japanese guys. Also, I'm just as glad to have had CJ on to help me review it. Looking at the timestamp, this one was a bit of a doozy. Thanks for coming on, dude.
Nah man, thank you for having me. I'd always wanted to give Splatoon a fair review, but it always seemed like the wrong time since the game kept getting new maps, weapons, and gear. It wasn't until recently that the game officially finished releasing new content, so now was the perfect time. And you know what? It was a total blast to review this with you, Jeff.
And thank you to everyone on Patreon who's kicked in to support Mother's Basement. Backers like you and the silver tier and higher patrons on screen right now make everything I do on this channel possible. You guys are awesome, and so is everybody who watches my videos. And I'd love to hear all your thoughts on Splatoon, so please leave a comment below, and when you're done, go check out CJ's channel. I recommend his video about stealth games that I helped to write. Or if you want to see more of my stuff, I recently did a critical analysis of a single level from Psychonauts, Gloria's Theater, which you may find more interesting. And if you want to catch more more videos like that and this, be sure to subscribe and follow me on Facebook and Twitter for regular updates about the channel. Also, you can check out my subreddit where I post everything that I make, or follow my Steam Curator page for regular recommendations about what games I think you guys should play.
This is CJ signing out. Stay beautiful and stay fresh.
Again, thanks for joining me, CJ, and thanks to all of you for watching. As always, this is Jeff Thu, professional ink bag, staying fresh in my mother's basement.